This course is about 2 hours, so if you're not expecting to spend 2 hours, I'll see you after an hour. I don't know. Our normal ones for the rest of the semester are only going to be an hour, but this one's a little bit different because we're trying to cover all of team science in 2 hours, and we're not going to do that. But we'll give you a nice overview and set you up for these upcoming workshops that we're offering through the Georgia Clinical and Translational Science Alliance grants. So let's get started. A little bit about me. I'm Christopher Wiese. I'm going to be your facilitator for this workshop today. I've lived all around, had 3 kids in 3 different states during graduate school, my postdoc in Georgia Tech once I moved here. We're not planning on moving again, so hopefully our family will stay relatively the same size. My research interests are focused on promoting worker well-being, how people transition from kind of like a work mode to home mode. But most of my research focuses on high stakes teams, which include astronauts teams, military teams, and believe it or not, science teams. And so I've researched this for a while, and I hope what I can provide today will give you kind of this brief introduction into team science, understanding how teams work and how to understand teams. So that's one of the purposes of this workshop, right? Just to give you like a precursor or a 2-hour information dump, essentially, of team science. Following that, the second purpose is to set you up to kind of, as an advanced organizer, to better approach the other workshops that we're going to be conducting through this mechanism in the future, which includes working and managing multiple teams, managing virtual teams, working and managing multiple teams, facilitating interdisciplinary teams. That's all happening this semester. And then next semester, we'll have 2 additional sessions on diversity, inclusion, and representation in teams, as well as team leadership and motivation. We don't have registration up for those yet, but keep a lookout for those second ones soon for spring. So on today's agenda, what we're going to be doing is covering these basic teamwork concepts, basically presenting you with a framework on ways to understand teams and teamworks. We'll be talking about some inputs of effective teams and teamwork, which will include a little bit on team formation and composition, as well as leadership. We'll then move on to mediators and talking about 2, I think, of the most important mediators of effective teamwork in team science, which is managing, leveraging, and mitigating conflict and promoting psychological safety. This is a pretty, I mean, not pretty interactive. We're not going to be interacting the whole time, but there will be activities, so be ready to be sent to breakout rooms. So I guess we should start with a so what. Why does this matter? Why do you research teams and team science? Why does this matter to me? Why am I here? Well, I think especially in scientific fields, collaborations are central to success. You can't get tenure by yourself. Teams are generally more successful at the complicated tasks that our careers require. And interdisciplinary teams, so working with other disciplines, can lead to even more success. And the call and need for interdisciplinary teams has been on the rise in recent years. There's more funding opportunities for interdisciplinary work. There's tons of funding announcements from NSF and NIH, their future of work NSS Future of Work grant is the primary example of that. And there's also many calls for these interdisciplinary institutes and centers, which are conduct valuable research when everyone can work together effectively. But that's not always the case, right? These interdisciplinary teams that you will be working on, and the team, even unidisciplinary teams that you work on currently, uh, they need to be able to see eye to eye to work together effectively, which isn't necessarily always the case. That slide should have came up a little bit earlier, but that is the indicator of how many authors and disciplines that have been working together um, over the course of the last couple of years. So the first thing I want to do is set you up with kind of that shared mental model, right? We need to kind of all be on the same page of what a team is before we get started. So I want you to use whatever device is available to you and go to menti.com, and you'll be asked for a little access code. The access code is 91139373. And I'm about to share my screen over there, and I want you to answer the question, what is a team? Was a team to you? We'll just take a couple minutes for your answers to come in. So you'll go to, hopefully you're seeing my other screen now. And at the top, you'll see, there we go. Got our first answer in, so hopefully there's not a lot of technical difficulties. There we go. Are you all able to see the Menti responses?
Yes, we can see them.
Perfect, thank you so much. Group of individuals working on a common goal or activity or towards a common goal. Group of individuals with different skills, contributions, etc. Group of people working together to achieve a common goal. Individuals working on a common goal. I think there's a common theme here. A group of people who share a goal. There's been one deviation from the common goal theme, and that is people, where is it, that have various expertise. There we go. So a group of individuals with different skills and contributions. That's a good addition to a group of experts, a group of expertise working on a common interest. Importantly to note, a group of experts is not necessarily an expert team, and that's hopefully what team science will help you understand a little bit more. A group of individuals who share similar different. These are all super excellent answers. I love all of them. We'll go back to the main screen now. By the way, we're going to be using Menti for the rest of the session, so I hope you all like that sort of format. So a lot of you touched on these like very, very well. So a group of a team's a group of two or more individuals who are dynamic, interdependent, and work adaptively towards a common goal. So one of the things I think that is important to notice there is the interdependence, right? You all rely on each other when you're part of a team. That's something to remember when you are a leader of that team, which I think a lot of you are going to be or currently are, right? You need to work interdependently with your team members, even if they have some sort of positional hierarchy with you. They operate in multi-level contexts, so individuals are nested in teams, teams are nested in organizations, and they're both influenced by, say, organizational context and as well as individual characteristics. And they vary substantially in their characteristics and dimensions across different types of teams. So you may belong with a lab team, your faculty could be a part of your team, your staff could be a team that you're on, so they can vary greatly. And so here are some of the dimensions that teams can vary on. So, for example, diversity can have a relatively homogeneous team versus a heterogeneous team with respect to just about any characteristic of diversity. Integration, so you can have a unidisciplinary team or a transdisciplinary team where it's a little bit beyond interdisciplinary, where you're combining multiple disciplines to create something new. You can have a very small team, which is just 2 or more individuals, or a large team. Usually mega teams are teams within teams. So it's a multi-team system, which Dr. Scheffler will be presenting on in November. Proximity is another dimension that teams can vary on. All of you can be co-located, or probably now many of you are globally distributed. You can have very aligned goals. So maybe some of you are working on upcoming grants where your goals are clearly aligned. Where you could also be working on a team where the individual members have divergent or potentially misaligned goals. Misaligned is never good, but divergent goals can sometimes be good. For example, dissemination and implementation science usually involves people within the community who have particular goals, as well as researchers who may have other goals. As long as there's an overarching vision, then you can be okay. Teams can be relatively stable. That's what most of us work on from a day-to-day basis, or they can be highly fluid. Think of your lab from semester to semester, or a surgical team working together with members varying across different performance episodes, which would be surgeries. And you can have low and high task interdependence. That can fluctuate within the team itself. So many members may be differently interdependent, and it can vary across different teams. So you can have a low sort of task interdependence team and a high task interdependence team. One book, if you're interested in learning more about this, is this Enhancing the Effectiveness of Team Science book. I think we link it at the end. If not, I'll shoot it to Lauren and she could share that with you. But if you're really interested in learning more and more about team science, I think this is a good introductory text. We don't have to go over in all of these different types of teams. I kind of did that at the high level already. So we'll move into, you all had super great answers. I hope that little introduction allows you to understand kind of how teams can vary substantially. And all of these factors that we mentioned earlier are going to affect how well the teams work together. And in order to understand the factors that are influencing, say, team performance, I always like to approach it through this input, mediator, and outcome framework. So in the case of the attendees here, many of you will be working on publishing articles, maybe grant submissions, maybe running your lab, and focused on well-being of your team members as well. Maybe not so much if you're working on a grant application, but within your lab and within a close-knit team that you're personally connected to, that should and can be an outcome. And so what leads to these things? Well, in the team science framework, we distinguish between these processes, which are behaviors, and emergent states, where it's kind of these attitudes that arise over time as the team works together. So processes include things like communication, coordination, and conflict. And we'll be kind of covering communication, but mostly focusing on conflict today. There are also emergent states like psychological safety, which we'll be talking about today, trust, cohesion, as well as things like mental models, which I tried to do, say, at the beginning of this talk by getting everyone on the same page with what teams are. So shared mental models is exactly that. People have the shared schema about a particular problem space and are approaching it through the same lens. There's also transactive memory systems, which isn't necessarily um, a shared space, but it's more of like who knows what on the team, and a kind of a network of knowledge across the team. And so these emergent states, well, emerge over time as people interact with one another. So you can think of processes in emergent states having a reciprocal relationship. And lastly, we have these team inputs. Now, team inputs is exactly what you might think, right? Who is on your team composition, team size. The bigger the team size, it may be harder to communicate, for example, as well as if you have a good leader, you may be communicating more effectively, coordinated better, and trusting more, which will hopefully lead to those outcomes at the end, more published articles, more grant submissions, and higher worker team member well-being. So our first topic that we're going to be talking about today is team composition. And for this, we're actually going to start with an activity that will, where you will be selecting a team. So for those of you who downloaded the file already, you're ahead of everyone else. I'm going to share that file again with you, and it has instructions on what to do there. So you're going to imagine that you're a new assistant professor in organizational psychology looking to form an interdisciplinary team to study psychological, physiological, and cognitive effects of commuting on work and families, and the implications these hold for infrastructure design. So right now we're going to split you up into breakout rooms, and you'll have two main assignments. That first assignment will be something that you do independently. So you may be sitting there quietly for a couple of minutes. You'd independently select your top 3 candidates, and from this team formation activity file that I sent to you, and then you're going to get together, and you'll do that for 5 minutes, and then you're going to get together, and then for 10 minutes respond and provide your top 3. Slowly coming back in. I think that should be everyone now. So let's debrief for a moment. If a representative from each of your teams are kind of pick who you picked and talk about why. We can see that Cohen was relatively consistent, but other than that, there's a wide variability on who you picked for your team. Any volunteers from that first group on who picked Andreas, Cohen, and Ward?
Sure. I actually submitted that a little bit prematurely, I realized. At first, I didn't pick up that I was in a breakout room. So that's where that came from. Other people on my team. Yeah, we had a great conversation. I think these first 2 were fairly consistently represented. Both Garza there, so potentially helping with fundraising, but also not worrying too much about first authorship and having the flexibility to be supportive, which would be really important. Maybe Gabrielle Cohen as our research anchor and thought leader. And then the last one didn't have such a strong consensus on, but I think overall we'd be looking for a candidate that is fairly junior, flexible to going along with what Cohen might be interested in, and may additionally, if they're a postdoc, for example, need to publish to succeed in their career. So they'd be motivated to stay engaged.
So that's great. Why do you think, what was the disagreement about the last candidate?
Oh, that's a great question. I guess it just comes from our different levels of understanding in terms of what I think the goals of the department were.
Okay. And so that's great. Thank you. So those are good, all reasons why each of those individuals should be elected to your team. How about that second one who had Tate, Roy, and Cohen?
That was our group. We wanted to go with Tate because we liked their experience of having sort of extremely successful publishing and their funding experience. We really liked the idea of continuous sort of relationships. So we chose Roy as well. There's already pre-established working relationships. Obviously, we really liked it. And we also chose Cohen because she was kind of a thought leader and kind of probably on the cutting edge of what comes next in our field, and getting exposed to that would build a well team together.
That's good. All really good reasons. How about the next team with Rebecca, Michael, and Angela, but with the GH?
That's actually just the names of us, the people that were in the group.
Yeah, I was like, I don't remember writing those people in the scenario. So who did you come up with?
I was in Michael's group.
Okay.
Yes.
Well, all right. So let's circle to the group that picked Cohen, Wen, and Cabrera.
That was our group. We actually, so all of us had individually chosen Doctors Cohen and Ng coincidentally. So then that was kind of a no-brainer. And it sounds like all of us approached it a little bit similarly in that we wanted people that represented different fields of scientific practice represented on the team. And then also the other thing, like the champion year team who has flexibility, someone who may have a little more time as a year person or then not someone different for third place, but his person which is we always made another different field. So whether or not you were someone who was from the history engineering side, and then we like number one teams.
It's really great question. I think it's important there to know that you think about one part of what we do, which is the different representation of the fields, right? Making sure that they're all represented based on one place. I think that's really good with Vera and willingness and capacity to work on a team to get that all really good reasons. I would like to also hear from those who selected Wen and Cohen, but then you get third. Maybe you can talk about why you might not have another.
Yeah, that was our group, and we had some technical difficulties where people didn't have access to the sheet, so that's one of the reasons why we really get there. But I think that our group heard a lot of things that have been said so far in terms of spreading expertise and all around, and wanting some senior and someone more junior with momentum and excitement to really keep about it moving forward. I think there were some conversations about being third person and sort of that I think that came up after yet was kind of talking about minimizing conflicts and like kind of steering away from some people because of how they work like a team member. Yeah, the full discussion just was really good.
Awesome. Yeah, I think you're right. You're on the characteristics to be evaluating for the effectiveness of the team, right? Someone can have a lack of prestige and a lot of expertise within a particular field and may not necessarily work well with others, which can be a bad thing. On the other hand, as we'll talk about a little bit later when we get to conflict session, conflict can be good. Depends on the type of conflict that emerges. But those who don't work well with teams, like that there's relationship conflict, right? You don't want that. Task conflict can be at times okay when you're operating within a psychologically safe environment where ideas can be expressed no matter how sort of out there they are in conflict with the status quo, and it could lead to something creative and new that you didn't necessarily have before. But we'll get there. I saw two other responses come in, but I think we've touched on. Well, let's see. Actually, are you both from the same group? I think we could do one more with Wen and Cohen.
Yes, we are both from the same group. Sure. So the miscommunication we got in place. In building the team, we really wanted to try to cover all the scientific expertise that was mentioned in the exercise. And we thought that Dr. Cohen brought the transportation expertise, Dr. Melton brought the cognitive piece of it, and as well as Dr. Figueroa. My teammate Taryn also mentioned that Dr. Figueroa, as a postdoctoral fellow, would bring significant energy drive based on her experience professionally. So we collectively kind of came together on that selection. I initially had Dr. Melton as one of my choices. After some discussion with the team, we decided the severe level of strictness was maybe a little bit too risky to infuse in the team. So we decided against that. So that's how we end up with our team. I don't know if Taryn, you want to add anything to that.
No, that's good, Ryan. Thank you.
Okay, that's absolutely great. Your conversation mirrors, I think, some of the feedback that I want to provide you all on for that. So representation across those fields is important, and then you also many of you mentioned the ability to work with teams or team members, which I think is the second most important thing, the most important characteristic in those descriptions. I think you all were hovering on and provided with a little bit more time because this exercise is usually a little bit longer. Provide more time, start talking about things about fit. So how well each of these individual team members complement each other. And did you just select most senior scholars? So with passing off or negating or underweighting some of their, say, propensity to work on teams or fit with other team members, did you sacrifice potential attitudinal problems for pedigree, which can be the most practical response but not necessarily effective over time? I think what I want to drill home here is this next one. Do you think about how these team members fit together with one another? This assignment gives you the opportunity to compose your team from scratch, which is not often the case. It's actually pretty rare that you can do this. Oftentimes, you already have a team together, whether it's a grant proposal or working in a lab, and you have to figure out who's going to fit your team the best. And so these decisions become a little bit more difficult because you not only have to assess, say, the attributes of the person who you're working with, but also how well they fit with the rest of your team and the culture that you have in whatever environment that you're going forward in. So there was no correct answer. It's kind of a misleading assignment for that reason. But the three most important things that you should be recognizing here is that personal biases, whether or not you know the person, will oftentimes influence your decision. And sometimes it will be in a positive light, or like if you know someone you want to work with them because you know you like them on a personal basis. And other times it may be in a negative way. So even if you do like a person and you want to work with them in the future, you may undervalue their attributes or their qualifications just so you don't be perceived as biased. Diversity is valuable in just about every form that it takes, so you all did an excellent job with that. But again, the take-home message here is this imperative that you consider fit. How well will these individuals work with one another? And that's especially important on more interdependent tasks, which hopefully your grant writing or your lab are. I do want to leave you with some, on the team composition bit, some of the findings in team composition literature. So some characteristics of the people that you're evaluating are good, no matter how what the current status of your team is. For example, high levels of conscientiousness across all the team members is shown to predict performance. It's important that you have a mixture of other characteristics like extroversion. Imagine having a bunch of people who are high in extroversion, like to talk, are very outgoing, working in a room together. It can get very loud very quickly, and that's what you get with a lot of these astronaut teams, which say even it's even more detrimental when you have lots of high levels of extroversion and type A personalities because they're not speaking the same language, right? They all come from different disciplinary backgrounds, and it can get much more conflictive when people are not operating off of the same base. They're not using the same jargon. They're not approaching the team from the same sort of problem schema. Agreeableness is also good to have a variety on. You want disagreeable people, not jerks, but some disagreeable people on your team, because if you say are on a creative task or there may be some errors that occur, very agreeable people tend not to bring that up. And if everyone is being agreeable, then you're not necessarily going to notice those mistakes. You're not necessarily going to hear about the things that are going wrong. You're going to stick to the status quo and may have some problems going forward. With respect to diversity of gender, so pops with gender heterogeneous teams receive 34% more citations than same gender teams. Having at least one female PI actually increases the likelihood of funding innovative ideas, according to research. Postdocs are more likely to lead to breakthrough publications than grad students or technicians. So maybe this is a good factor to take away for if you leave your position or have the opportunity to either hire a postdoc or a grad student. Involving senior personnel can lead to publications in higher impact journals, but you have to be careful that the senior personnel has a good team orientation. And smaller teams are more likely to develop innovative research ideas. When you get a large amount of people within a team working together, you could, the conversation will not necessarily produce these innovative ideas because it may be too much trouble to be vulnerable in those situations. You develop psychological safety and trust within the teams, which promote these innovations quicker when you have a smaller team or group. I have this example here about fit, but I think we've talked about it enough already and can move on to the team composition. That really depends on the problem task that you are working on, right? So within the literature, if when sort of group together, a small team would be say 3 to 5 individuals. Now these 3 to 5 individuals that have equal weight. So I'm not thinking about maybe your maybe a lab team, right? It's 3 to 5 individuals who will be making at least some degree decisions on how the team moves forward. So that's what I mean when I'm talking about small teams. Small teams are always better if you're able to get diversity of opinions on things. Great question. Team composition summary real quick. It's not always better for selecting the best individual team member. It does not consider how well that team members can get along with other individuals. Interpersonal dynamics often lead to success. So you need to ask yourself not who the best scholar is, but who the best scholar or person or whoever you're trying to get is who is the best scholar for that team. Diversity is critical, as we just showed through evidence from journal articles. Homogeneity is only beneficial for some characteristics, conscientiousness and intelligence. Homogeneity can lead to derivative ideas and adherence to the status quo, which is not necessarily what we're doing here. There are many types of diversity, and most of them have benefits. So it's important, like we just mentioned, to keep your research team small, promotes innovation, allows you to be more agile and likely to pivot if you need to, say, respond to feedback, or if there's a brand new call that's tangential to the idea that we're working on. And leading a large team, as some of you may know, can get unwieldy quickly. So it's important when you, in the case of centers and these ERCs, you're going to have a large team if you're a main PI. I know we have diversity of seniority here on the call. In those cases, you can't have small teams. So it's always important in those cases, and I believe Marissa will talk about this more with the managing teams talk, is ensuring that you delegate and empower those who are below you to make those decisions. And we'll talk about that right now, actually, when we move on to leadership. So let's say that you've assumed that you've assembled this other team, the appropriately diverse to pursue interdisciplinary research idea. I'm going to ask you a question of, say, how are you going to lead your team? How will you get your team to where they need to go? What style of leadership you will use, and how will you handle conflict on your team? And when do you learn this type of leadership? Well, the answer to the last question is you don't right now. We're never trained on how to be good leaders. But using those first 3 bullet points, how are you going to lead your team? How will you get your team to where they need to go? And what style of leadership will you have? I want you to think about those sort of functions of a leader and go back to Menti. I'm going to screen share again on the Menti and put in your answers. It can be real quick about what makes a good leader. And so we'll give folks a couple minutes to enter in their responses. So you can think about leaders that you've had in the past. You can think about what you've seen personally that's been effective. What are the characteristics of that good leader? So what is it about them as a person? What behaviors do they engage in? You can also try it from the negative, right? What has gone wrong? Like leaders who don't do this are a good leader. That's some really great responses coming in too. I think I may have primed you to think about delegation with that first response. Approachability is always important. Effective feedback provider, communicating effectively, leading by examples, excellent. Defers to, I love that one. Defers to the expertise of others. You don't need to be a leader in all situations. Hearing all voices on the team and ensuring that individuals know that their perspective has been considered in the decisions. And giving employees voice, or workers or team members voice, is incredibly important. Here's some great characteristics: individuals who are honest, have integrity, are transparent. And we're going to get to this again in just a bit. Leaders who admit their mistakes are probably one of the best leaders that you can have. Those who are good listeners, who are patient, provide big picture to motivate people. I think that's the first bit that we've seen there. Providing that vision for followers or team members, whoever to have. This is an excellent point to it. A hands-on leader that's willing to get in the trenches with the team. These are all great. I know we have not many of you have been probably had leaders who just delegated and not necessarily knew what they were asking of you. And so a leader who is willing to do the job themselves is absolutely a great answer and a great characteristic of a good leader. Those who are decisive, supportive, and open to suggestions. A seemingly but important nuance to the leader getting their hands dirty and doing what needs to get done is not micromanaging. So letting employees be empowered, workers be empowered, is great. Listening and encouraging people to be constructive while maintaining a safe environment. Those are excellent, excellent responses. Setting a goal, vision, recognizing the value of each team member. Frequent feedback, that is feedback when needed. Frequent feedback when needed is important, because then you might be bordering on micromanaging. So all of these are excellent answers, and I want to bring us back to the PowerPoint for a little bit. You guys know what a good leader is, but you may not have necessarily been trained on it, right? When you graduated grad school, I had a class on leadership because I'm an industrial organizational psychologist, and we can learn about the concepts. But when it came to actually managing people or making sure that people felt encouraged or that they had a voice, we were never necessarily trained on that. And so those who had a style that they're usually adopted it from their advisor. It may not be a good style for you. Not every single leadership, not every single person has the same capacity of demonstrating a variety of effective leadership behaviors. And so you need to find out what works for you and your team the best. And the main leadership theory, this is, the main leadership sort of style or theory that we pull on is transformational leadership, which composes of these 4 components. Idealized influence, which is part of that ability to convince others. Inspirational motivation, we saw that come up a couple times in the mentee survey. Intellectual stimulation, that wasn't provided as much. That's ensuring that not only that your team members are inspired, but you're providing them with, say, an intellectually higher goal. And individualized considerations. So not every sort, even if you are a good storyteller or can operate on a sort of inspire people on a general level, that may not work for every single member of your team. So it's important to consider the individual characteristics of each of your team members and provide them exactly what they need. There's also theories, another theory is leader-member exchange. This is relationship-based theory, and there's a lot more that you can read up on that. It describes the relationship between a leader and a follower, and what develops a good relationship and what develops a poor relationship. But I think the most important one beyond transformational leadership theory is collective leadership, which focuses on particular roles that the leader can adopt, and really demonstrates the point that leadership does not necessarily need to come from a leader. So whoever's the formal or hierarchical leader on your team is not the only person who can demonstrate leadership behaviors or fill in leadership functions. Leadership does not necessarily reside in one specific person. There is a question, how is transformational leadership individualized consideration different from leader-member exchange? Individualized consideration, that's a good question. Individualized consideration is more of a adaptive style between depending on who is on your team. Leader-member exchange, that theory just focuses on good relationships and the behaviors that make up a good relationship. So I could have a good relationship with one of my fellow team members or followers, and the behaviors I use to cultivate that relationship won't be the same as the behaviors I use to cultivate with another individual. So those different behaviors are individualized consideration, but the quality of that relationship is what leader-member exchange theory gets at. Good question. So we're going to focus a little bit on collective leadership for a moment and talk about the different roles that folks can take. So folks can take the role of navigator, who a lot of you mentioned this, right? Establishing and maintaining a clear purpose or direction, or an engineer, providing structure for the group and a task. A social integrator, that's the person who helps maintain healthy relationships, make sure the team's cohesive and working well together. And liaison, so these are the individuals who may have a greater network than you, and that they can reach out and create great relationships with external stakeholders. Now, oftentimes when we think of a leader, we think of a leader as wearing, say, any one of these hats at a given time. And I don't necessarily think that's the best way to think about leadership on the team that you're on. You don't necessarily, if you're the leader of the team, need to wear all of these hats, because you have other team members who you can work with who can wear these hats and take that responsibility on, who can better serve those sorts of functions. But importantly, just because you are, say, the navigator at a particular point in the project's time or a particular point in the team's life cycle doesn't necessarily mean you need to stick to that role as time moves on. So a good leader will also change hats with other members of their team in order to ensure that the team is most effective at that particular point in time. And it's difficult, right? It's difficult when you are the navigator of the team for so long. You need to step down when the project moves on from, say, from the research side of things into the dissemination and implementation side. It's been your baby for so long, you feel like you've provided a great and clear purpose and division, but you have to give that up. And so that takes a lot of, you need to be humble, and you need to recognize when those opportunities come to, shift the hat. So collective leadership is, we've been talking about this for a little bit, team members sharing leadership responsibility. And as I just mentioned, the enactment of these roles that we just mentioned may vary by time and probably should vary by time. This is an example of that, which I kind of very narratively went through, right? Janet often serves as the social integrator of the team, but has recently experienced a loss in family. That role still needs to be filled, but as a good leader, you may recognize that Janet is not necessarily in a position to serve effectively in that role because she's has her own stuff going on, and so it's your responsibility to pick up that hat and let your team member recover. And here's another example. While Steve is often the navigator, there's a decision needing to be made about medical device protocol, an area outside Steve's expertise. So Steve will need in that point to step down and take up maybe not even put on another hat and just be okay with someone else taking a lead. I think the important thing is that for you to take away here is that there's a lot of different responsibilities and roles that leaders are expected to take on. And the leader doesn't necessarily need to always take on those responsibilities, and those responsibilities or roles can change over time. Your role as a hierarchical leader of your team, if you're in that position, is to be cognizant of the role that your team members need at the particular moment. Be aware of the leadership needs of each individual team member, and be ready to step back and allow the team to lead themselves. Empower your team to take control of the situations by instilling confidence and providing guidance of when it's appropriate for them to step up, because many of your team members might not be willing to take that step. And expect to take action outside your leader responsibility. This is really hard to know when you should be taking action outside of your leader responsibility. So because it could turn into micromanaging or could signal to your team that you don't trust them. I think it's when you need to, leaders are people who get shit done when nothing else is getting done. And so when that happens, when there's a need for you to fill that's outside your leader responsibility and maybe the responsibility of other team members, it's important to talk to them about it and walk them through why you did what they did, why you did what you did, and how we can improve that going forward. So they don't feel like you're micromanaging, and that you can instill faith and confidence in them. So by doing these things, your team should engage in effective team processes and develop the necessary emergent states. And we're going to talk about those emergent states right now. In particular, we're going to talk about conflict. So when you're working on a team, your team's going to conflict with one another, right? People have different perspectives and experiences that they bring to the table. There may be perceptual gaps, so different understandings of the problem that your team is trying to tackle, or different ways that they are used to getting work done. There may be, it's important that you have some sort of cognitive and effective integration, which we'll get to in a minute, because you don't necessarily want to get to a conflict episode. We want to manage those conflict episodes effectively by recognizing when they occur, what type of conflict they are, and addressing them appropriately. So this is a little bit maybe too detailed, but people have those different backgrounds, which we talked about before, which influences the schema that they're bringing to the particular problem space, that little globe in the middle. So they're viewing this problem space through a different lens, which could be on the verge of causing conflict. One ways that you can alleviate or manage conflict is through using the shared language, having similar ways of reasoning, identifying and addressing differences and preferences and priorities, making sure that everyone has the same goals and objectives. These things are much easier to discuss when you have some affective integration, which is the trust between team members and the respect between team members. And as much as some people may not like this, making sure your team members like you, you're more receptive to information from people that you like versus those who you may not like, in order to prevent these potential conflict episodes. on the other hand, we don't want to mitigate all sorts of conflict. As I said before, there's different types of conflict, and there was a slide in here that I actually cut out that talked about task conflict, relationship conflict, and process conflict. Relationship and process conflict are usually lead to these negative effects. I'll just pop up now. These are conflicts between individuals on an interpersonal basis. That's the relationship conflict, or in the way that things are done. That's the process conflict. When you don't have a good relationship between your team members, task conflict can also lead to these negative outcomes, especially reduced productivity and increased team stress. However, if you have a good environment, a good psychological safety, you express conflict in a meaningful and appropriate way, you can facilitate new and creative ideas. You can avoid groupthink, which is just a static way of thinking about things, or people not bringing up conflicting ideas that challenge the status quo. You're more likely to identify problems. That's what task conflict oftentimes is, and you can, at the end of the day, learn more and increase your productivity. But it's important to realize. So I guess the way that you increase the benefits, how you get the most and leverage conflict, comes from how you're expressing yourself during, say, maybe some conflicting attitudes. So I'm just gonna talk through these two sorts of examples, but I want you to identify by speaking up or entering into the chat what the differences are between these two different versions of the same sort of conflict episode. So in the first one, it's Mary tries to explain why she believes the allocation is adequate and even provides a bit of discretionary funds to the project. Tom listens but remains concerned. He suggests that Mary may not understand the hidden costs in the situation and that they may want to discuss the issue further. Mary disagrees. So that's an example of a conflict. Here's another way that it could have unfolded. Mary defends her reasoning and unequivocally states that the allocation is adequate and might even be more than is needed. Tom interrupts her before she's finished. He asserts that Mary does not have the expertise to see the hidden cost in the situation and demands that they reopen the issue. Mary again disagrees. So there are several differences, I think, here, and you can see kind of one that is that's going to produce greater and not productive conflict than the other. But what are your thoughts? What are the differences between these two scenarios that would promote conflict, bad conflict?
Yeah, I think the area is being a little more transparent and so focused on a solution to Tom's problem rather than just telling him no, which by saying no, Tom doesn't necessarily know why she's saying no or how much of any thought she's putting with it.
That's a good bit. The man splaining comment is true as well. It could be a person splaining if I just switch if I use gender neutral.
Yeah, sorry. I didn't mean to. Either way, he was telling her she didn't know something. Just a matter of suggesting versus telling.
Yeah, that's exactly it. So and we'll get to this in a second, but the other differences. But the comment about the not knowing is the attribute of the person, right, and not the problem, and that is good in neither of the cases, right? He's just may not understand the hidden costs, which is a less conflictive way than saying something about a person's expertise. That is a good pickup, I think. There's also interrupting. Interrupting is always a bad way. I tend to do that, and I need to catch myself often. So that is very true. There is that difference between she believes and unequivocally states. So this is between the versions. That's an excellent point. So the issue is still open for debate in version A, where in version B, people are already on the defensive of one person considering it a foregone conclusion and another person considering it shouldn't be, which can exacerbate the conflict experienced in that situation. Let's see, any more examples? Yeah, neither one is actively listening to each other. That's true in both cases. But you're going to have oftentimes people not actively listening to one another. But I think you're right also that version A is a little bit better. And collaboration, we try and avoid the absolute comment. There's also aspects you're not aware of. Leave some space in the argument, and it also gives room for negotiation. Yeah, I think that is important, that you want to make sure that you encourage voice rather than shutting them off before anyone begins. And we'll get to that in a little bit when we talk about psychological safety. So you all hit on most of them. So one is Mary tries to explain why she leaves, right? That's the opening door. Mary defends, putting people on the defensive, and unequivocally states, which is closing the door to any sort of debate, which could prompt others to interrupt, which is, again, furthering the sort of conflicting episode into an explosion state. In the other scenario, Tom listens to the complete thought, but still remains cognitive concern, but doesn't express that in the middle of Mary talking. He suggests that Mary may not understand, which is hard to express in words, that it is designed to just keep the doors open and is probing to see where the miscommunication is. Because you can say that to someone in various different ways, and it can be interpreted in many. Here, the situation is a little, on version B, it's a little bit more clear how he feels, right? He asserts that Mary does not have the expertise, which is a lot more harsh than the former, and demands to reopen the issue. In either case, Mary disagrees, but I think in version A, you're more likely to come to some sort of agreement or resolution through a good negotiation process as compared to version B. And the point here that came up a little at the bottom is that expressing conflict, the way that you express conflict, matters. And so there's a good way to sort of conceptualize this is that when you're expressing conflict is on these two different sort of dimensions of intensity and directness. And so what we want to get to eventually is a good debate, on the topic, rather than arguing about it. So in arguing, the conflict expression is high and intense, and it's directive towards individuals or the particular topic that you are having a disagreement on. And so, as I tried to show earlier in version B, by Mary unequivocally stating, that leads Tom to be on the defensive and then interrupts, which puts Mary in a different position. And so you get these sort of conflict spirals. And you may not be sharing good information. So that's what that negative arrow. You're sharing information, but not necessarily information that will help resolve the disagreement. And there's this upward spiral also of negative emotions. When folks are expressing conflict in a intense but not direct way, so you're not approaching the topic from a good, or the disagreement from a good space, you may not necessarily have these conflict spirals because you're not being directly conflictive with the individual or the topic at hand. But you're not, these are things like being dismissive or teasing or complaining. So it's distracting from a resolution, which may not lead to additional conflict spirals because it's more passive in a way in nature. But you're going to still have those increases in negative emotions, a lack of good information, and still not come to a resolution. Disguise is a little bit different. That's the low intensity, low directiveness. This is an ambiguous reason why there is conflict. It may or may not lead to conflict spirals. Information can be good or bad, and it will likely, but may not necessarily present negative emotions. What you want is a good debate. Now, I know that there's some things that you shouldn't and can't debate, but when there is something that can be debated, it should. So hopefully when the debate is focused on a disagreement on a particular aspect of the project, and you are direct but not necessarily intense, you will have less conflict spirals, which is good. Good information will be shared with one another. There'll be less negative emotions, and when team members respect one another, you may actually, when you're having these conversations, that respect will come out in the language, which can lead to positive emotions within your team. So your take-home strategies when handling conflict are these preemptive strategies, which we didn't go over much, but are on our Team Science website. is using these collaborative and welcome agreements. So these collaborative agreements or welcome letters kind of set the stage of how teams will unfold over time. In particular, there's a section in which you can talk about how conflict will be handled on the team whenever there's disagreements, with respect to the time we meet, to authorship, to aspects of the protocol. You can talk about how it will be handled within these collaborative agreements or welcome letters. And by doing that, people aren't surprised necessarily when authorship decision is handled by consensus or 3/4 majority, or at the discretion of the PI, which you probably shouldn't put in there, but that you can. Like I said, it sets expectations, establishing teamwork dynamics, and promotes trust. And it allows for potentially conflicting issues to be identified and discussed in a more welcoming environment. So before the conflict happens, for example, scheduling issues can be handled at the very beginning of a project's onset rather than later on, when some of these things may just be overlooked. For in situ situations or strategies, it's always important that you engage in the conflict at the opportune time. Letting conflict sit is going to tell your team two things. One, you don't care about the issue at hand, and two, you may not respect the other person's opinion on the conflict, whatever the disagreement is on. So it's important to be to try and direct conflict towards shared interests, and when you have some sort of disagreement within your environment. So this is addressing needs and desires of both parties, which will increase the likelihood of agreement. Sometimes you can't do this, but it's always important to at least recognize the needs and desires and perspectives of individuals holding divergent opinions. Don't get in a power competition, nor make it personal. I think those are pretty easy and simple takeaways. You don't want to be coercive in your resolution of power, and you shouldn't bring up past sort of performance behaviors about that person that are irrelevant to the conflict that you are holding at hand. It's also important to be a role model in how to handle the conflict. So always try and be more direct when a conflict episode occurs, but not necessarily intense. And that gets at that last bit, the conflict resolution styles, which is I think the expression of conflict should really tell you. After the conflict occurs, people often don't do anything. The task is done, time to move on, what's next? But conflict, even if it's task-based, may hold long-term implications. So after you resolve or ensure that this particular conflict episode has been resolved, it's important to reflect with the people who are involved in the conflict to discuss the conflict and how it could have been handled differently, whether it's how the conflict was expressed in the moment, in the situation, or the sort of circumstances that led to the conflict. There are cases where you may need to repair relationships that have been damaged during the conflict. This could be relatively tricky if those individuals are not necessarily motivated to repair those relationships, but I would recommend making attempts to try in a more social atmosphere. And then the conflict episode should not have long-lasting interpersonal implications. So it's important that you release and allow people to sort of move on with their lives and not bringing stuff up again. And so as we finish up with conflict, we're going to talk about another mediator here, which is psychological safety. So psychological safety is the shared belief that group members will not make fun of, ridicule, punish, or humiliate you for speaking up with ideas, questions, or concerns, right? It's the comfortability in being vulnerable. And we've talked about this several times already, for a leader to be able to demonstrate that they're comfortable with being vulnerable by doing things like admitting mistakes. You'll hear this term psychological safety a lot, but it's important to recognize that it isn't being nice, agreeable, or complacent, right? We talked about some of the team composition variables that predict good performance, and being too agreeable can be detrimental to the team, and that's not what psychological safety is about. You want with psychological safety, you want everyone to be open in expressing their various ideas or opinions, no matter how they are. It's also not trust. So trust is more feeling safe and knowing that someone can do their job or that you can rely on them for more task-based purposes. Psychological safety is more of an atmosphere on the team. It's a shared belief between the group members. So it's an attribute of the team itself, not an attribute of how much you have confidence in another individual's propensity or ability to perform some action. And it's great. I think out of all the emergent states, it's one of the most important to have because research shows that produces more learning, more resiliency, more innovativeness, more and better performance. What we don't often talk about, especially with our lab teams or teams that we interact with on a daily basis, is the psychological health of the team members. And so psychological safety has also been shown to promote feelings of belongingness, respect towards one another, feelings that your team members have voice, as well as their general well-being and happiness. And the way that you promote psychological safety on a team all starts with communication. So communication, if you remember from the Mediators, would be a process, right? It's a behavior. So communication is key to all of the things that you think about with respect to team effectiveness, whether it's an interdisciplinary team or whether it's your lab team or really any sort of relationship that you have. Communication is key to producing these emergent states. But it's not just talking, right? Communication is a necessary but not sufficient condition. Effective and ineffective teams don't really differ in the amount in which they communicate with one another. It's what they are talking about that matters. So ineffective teams will often communicate about things that people already know, that are shared information among the team that don't necessarily move the status quo or move the needle. They're talking about these things. They aren't talking about unique information or new ideas. And that's likely because they don't necessarily feel safe in bringing these ideas up to you or to their fellow team members. And a lot of things within the team environment could make them feel unsafe at bringing these things up. There are the structural factors. So organizational department structure is one. This also bleeds into your position, right? If you're leading a research team, your lab director, followed by postdocs, followed by grad students, followed by undergraduate research assistants. Those sorts of structural factors can lead people to not feel safe in bringing up their own ideas. Ambiguous job descriptions as well could lead to this. Many of us here have gone from undergraduate to graduate to postdoc to some other position, and there are responsibilities that we do not expect that we will have to take on, that we do take on, that may not have been necessarily described effectively within the job description. And being told to do something that you didn't think that you had to do will lead to your acceptance of, say, these additional responsibilities without realizing whether or questioning whether or not you should be getting these things to do. There's also personal factors that can stop people from feeling safe. Individuals who don't like working with teams are not going to feel necessarily safe or going to be less open with their fellow team members. Different personalities, characteristics will prevent you from feeling safe on a team. So those who are more introverted or more neurotic may not necessarily lead to a shared belief in a team's ability to be vulnerable. Self-confidence and efficacy are also important to those behaviors that signal psychological safety. So if you don't have high confidence or efficacy, you may not be bringing up errors that other people commit or that yourself commit. And so that could lead to not a lot of development of psychological safety. Norms and cultures, so where you came from, may have established this idea of what, when, and who should bring up these conflictive ideas. And you bring those norms sort of with you. And you may not necessarily be in an atmosphere that allows you to express, that may not be congruent with your other fellow team members and their norms and expectations. And so following up with the barriers of psychological safety, when there's a lack of psychological safety, team members are less likely to speak up with unique opinions or recommendations. They're less likely to point out their own and other errors that they commit. They're less likely to develop, to discuss interpersonal mistreatment. So when they're being mistreated on a team, whether that is given more things to do than someone else, or whether or not it's more critical in nature, they're not going to be bringing up those factors with other people, and they're more likely to behave in a way that preserves the status quo, where they're not talking about things and they just go into their own world. When this is the case, teams don't learn. You're not going to learn if you don't recognize and talk about your mistakes. You're going to experience the same mistakes and failures because you're not learning when you actually experience them, and your team members are going to be unhappy. They're not going to feel supported. They're not going to feel respected, and they won't feel like they belong. They won't feel like part of the team, and they eventually leave the project that you're working on, leave the lab that you're in, or leave the organization. And I know we have a wide range of audiences here. So what we're going to do now is since I've been talking a lot recently, is maybe do like a 10-minute, let's do a 7-minute discussion about a time in which where you didn't feel safe to speak up and take an interpersonal risk, why you didn't do that, tie it back to the barriers that we just talked about. Did your teammates know that you felt that way? Talk about that with your breakout group. And then I think most important, and what you should really focus on now that I kind of did some bad time management, what actions could your teammates have taken in these scenarios to make you feel like you could take more of an interpersonal risk? So we're going to go to breakout rooms again real quick. And I think given the time with about 15 minutes left, let's do 5 minutes and then come back here.
I think something for me that always makes me feel comfortable to take risks is when people first take risks themselves first, and then two, acknowledge the discomfort, and this is like a new team, and that we're kind of all in this shared space of discomfort and learning each other. So setting up the environment for risk early on.
That's perfect. That's good. Setting up the environment early on for people to feel comfortable, I think, is one of the most important things that you can do. Anyone else want to share something?
I think something along the lines of offering anything really, any kind of a pathway or communication channel for enabling others to say things while saving face. So for example, if you have a supervisor that something like, hey, I'm aware that sometimes I can feel regarding something like that, if that's a his or her problem, and then saying, hey, what my number two, and if you're concerned, I say something that doesn't make sense, definitely run it down, right? That's kind of that's just a thought, because it's already at a point where people don't feel like they take that risk, and it's really not their fault.
I think you're right in the sense of you need to be able to recognize your own faults and demonstrate that. And as we're running up on time, usually this is like an activity, but I have bad time mentions because we're still creating a psychological safety environment here. Here are some ways that you can promote psychological safety on your team. Be clear and transparent with your expectations from the get-go. There needs to be a bi-directional agreement on the roles and responsibilities between you and your team members. So even if this is important when you are in a hierarchical position of power, where the roles and responsibilities may not necessarily, people will be less likely to speak up. So it's important that you have a bi-directional agreement, making sure that folks are speaking up about what their roles and responsibilities are and what they believe they are. It's important to recognize on your team why particular voices are needed, why these roles and responsibilities are important, why the perspective that this person brings to the team is important. So that instills a sense of confidence and respect before the team even gets started, and acknowledge that you are interdependent, right? That you all need to be able to work together in order to accomplish whatever you're going for. Otherwise, it may just fall apart. We talked about a couple modeling behaviors, but I think we didn't really address modeling curiosity. So why individuals have particular opinions that they have is especially important. So be proactive in doing that. But that can get annoying after a while for the person having to explain themselves consistently. So be wary with modeling curiosity. You need to be sure to be empathetic, so understanding the situation that people are in. We talked about this already. Being vulnerable, acknowledging your own fallibility, and pointing out your own mistakes will help you it'll help others point out their own mistakes and feel less bad when their mistakes are pointed out. It's important to walk the talk. So you can say something like, I'm encouraging everyone to speak up and there's no bad opinions here. And then when someone does, you just either shut them down or ignore it or be dismissive of it. And that could be relatively bad for promoting psychological safety as well. It's even worse when you shoot them down initially. So don't necessarily shoot the messenger. Allow the expression of voice on your team. So we got about 4 minutes left, and I have some closing remarks. Does anyone have questions about psychological safety?
I have a question. What works well for mission astronauts, these high stakes teams? What works well for creating, for enabling people on this team to speak up if the leader is just really just not liking, threatening, something like that?
Yeah, I think mission control, if I'm being honest, demonstrating these behaviors and managing and encouraging, being an outlet when the leader themselves cannot necessarily be an outlet. However, I should also say that leaders are, especially with these long duration space flights, teams are not only being trained on mission tasks, but also team skills as well. They're learning these things, which will help allow them to point out and develop the skills that needed to model psychological behaviors that promote psychological safety say when they're going to Mars and communication delay with mission control is significant.
Maybe that was a red herring. More for a research team, getting people who might not feel like comfortable kind of speaking up about their experiences. Say there's a leader that's like shouting at them behind the scenes. Like, is there like a psychological like hazing? Is there something that tends like if there's a common hazing type behavior occurring? Does research find that eventually leads the subordinates to accumulate enough trust? Or
so I think if there are strong enough behaviors to demand psychological safety, you're never going to reach it if it's coming from the leader, no matter what other behaviors the team members model, right? And so at that point, it may, whatever sort of things that you're doing may not be effective because you're always getting hit down on the other side by the abusive leader. It will take the leader in those circumstances to recognize that they're being wrong. Hopefully, it's not too extreme, and by you as a leader, a person in a lower hierarchical position, hopefully you'll be able to demonstrate that and lead them on a path to recognize their own fallibility. Knowing some professors and some some more senior PIs, that may not necessarily happen, but it may.
Interesting. So not accusing them, but like creating a situation where they say, like exception, they say for themselves. Well, dream of the dream. Okay.
So let's finish this off real quick. We'll be sending these slides around, so I'm not going to go too much in detail about them. But you can develop these individual development plans with your team members from the very beginning. That can really help facilitate the collaboration going forward. And we provide some resources here for that. It's the same thing with your postdocs. And some institutions provide, within the Georgia CTSA, provide services that you can use to better have stronger relationships with your postdocs. So I just applied for an SF grant. So actually following through on a postdoc mentoring plan that you put together. For yourselves, it may be important to get a mentor and have them talk about things that make them successful. Having that sort of outside source to talk about will be important. Developing your own personal plan, whether that is within your team or ways that you want to develop your team skills instead of reaching out and collaborating. I know this is important to some of you, and as we're at time, I'll send this around, but it's important to recognize that some institutions are recognizing that collaboration and teamwork and interdisciplinary collaboration is the future of science and have been putting that sort of language within their tenure and promotion packages. And that's important because most of the time we're supposed to be independent researchers pursuing our own research streams in the weeds of everything we get promoted, but that is slowly changing. And that's it. Since we're at time, I'm happy to stick around for a little bit and answer any questions that you have. Hopefully you learned something. Hopefully this puts you in a position of learning more from those future sessions. And thanks for coming in today.